Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Let's get rolling. I wanted to discuss the dialectic using both the critical realism of Roy Bhaskar and Maoism Third Worldism. I know this person, a Marxist, who rejects the dialectic. When I first met that person, and I won't mention that person's name, um, I thought the person was kind of odd. And then I looked into it and I found that there were actually quite a number of Marxists that reject the dialectic. The reason I think that that is the case is because the dialectic is somewhat confusing in the writings of Marx. It was even more confusing in the writings of Hegel, and perhaps even more confusing than that in the writings of Fichte. But Roy Bhaskar has addressed that problem and has created a kind of new dialectic, or a refashioned, improved dialectic, which explains how the dialectic operates in a way I think that most people can understand and accept. Many people argue that the dialectic is too abstract, and they reject it on that basis. Well, Roy Bhaskar made the dialectic concrete or real. He was a critical realist, so he made it real. Essentially, what Roy Bhaskar did is he took the dialectic, which classically is thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and he renamed it absence, absenting the absence, and transformation. So, for example, let's take racism as an absence. The absenting of that absence would be anti-racism. And obviously, our society would be transformed to a degree if we became truly anti-racists. Now, ultimately, a complete transformation of society is only possible under communism or socialism. So those are only partial solutions to the problems which avail us. But at least they are better than nothing. And certainly racism is a serious problem, especially right here where I am in the United States, where it appears as though the commitment that was made back in the 1960s, and I remember that, to eliminating racism through the civil rights movement has been lost. I had some renewed hope with Black Lives Matter, but where is Black Lives Matter? I haven't seen a single demonstration of Black Lives Matter in several years. I mean, maybe there are some people who still attend meetings or do something in connection with it, but if so, I don't know about it, and I think I would. So that's very sad to me. But nevertheless, as a critical realist, I can look at the problem of racism in American society, and that problem is enormous. And I can reflect on ways in which that racism could be absented, meaning eliminated, absenting the absence. It's a play on words, but it's a useful play on words because if you have an absence, what do you do with it? You absent it. You literally take that absence and throw it away. And then you see what you have. Now, I don't know what the United States would look like without racism. The history of the United States is ingrained with racism. And so it is difficult for me to imagine an America that is not racist, that does not have institutional racism. And the problem is that when the term racism comes up, many people who define themselves as white, and I wish people did not define themselves as white, that is a term that was born out of the plantation system, but nevertheless, people who define themselves as white frequently become defensive and say, oh, I'm not a racist. Well, it is not for me to judge whether any particular individual has the stain of racial bigotry, or I guess you could say internalized racism. But when sociologists talk about racism, what we mean primarily is not internalized racism, but institutionalized racism, meaning the racism which exists in a society and results in things like differential employment, differential income, and differential status. And that has been the heritage, the legacy of racism until this day. Now, has racism diminished? To some extent, yes. In other ways, it seems to me to actually be increasing right now, because there is a kind of apathy concerning racism I have noticed here in the US. And that is the last thing that we need regarding racism in the US. Now, let me take that concept of the dialectic and relate it to Maoism third worldism. Most forms of communism, virtually all forms of communism, have been first worldist. Marx and Engels were first worldists. So were Stalin, and so were Lenin. Mao was not, but Mao was not exactly a third worldist either. He spoke about the third world, but he really was not a third worldist in the sense that I am as a Maoist third worldist. And so when we look at first worldism and we see that all the projects which have attempted to establish communism have failed. There is no more Soviet Union. It is now basically a collection of different countries. Russia itself, the center of the Soviet Union, is now a system of authoritarian capitalism. Mainland China, still officially called the People's Republic of China, is no longer a People's Republic. It too is now a system of authoritarian capitalism. Cuba, under Fidel Castro, was a wonderful communist society. I always loved Fidel. But with the passing of Fidel, when his brother took over, it seems as though Cuba forgot itself. And gradually, Cuba is retreating back into a type of capitalism. It certainly does not have the same commitment to communism as it did during the years of Fidel, especially when Fidel was a young man. But even as an old man, that kind of commitment, that kind of steadfastness in communism is basically lost. And so revolution ultimately is a process of absenting the absence. When we look at capitalism, which is the absence, the major absence in the world, or if we use Immanuel Wallerstein's term, the capitalist world system, we can see capitalism as a kind of system of intersectionality where all of these different oppressions like racism, like sexism, like ageism, like ethnicism, like ableism or disableism in the UK, are intersections in capitalism. And so it is a system, not simply an economic framework. In other words, that kind of simplistic economism, which some Marxists adhered and still adhere to, is a waste of time. It does not go anywhere. Capitalism is more than economics. Capitalism includes economics, but it's not just economics. It's much more than that. And so we need to eliminate all the oppressions, or to use Roy Bhaskar's term, absent all the oppressions in capitalism, in the capitalist world system, in order to be free of capitalism. And ultimately, we will have, ideally, some type of, I guess, socialistic or communistic world system. Exactly what that will look like, I have no idea. I don't think it is useful, particularly to reflect on that or speculate on that too much. We can a bit, but we don't know. We need to focus on current material conditions, not on the conditions of some speculative future, because no one knows what the future will look like. But we know what the present is. We see how the world has been drifting toward fascism. The entire world. The promise of the United States moving away from MAGA is now gone. MAGA has returned. Now, would the situation be better under Kamala Harris? I don't think so. There is no real solution to the problems which are now present themselves before us within the capitalist framework. Whether it was Harris or Trump or somebody else, that would not fix the problem of capitalism. And ultimately, capitalism itself needs to be eliminated, especially because capitalism is such a tremendous drain on the third world and on the fourth world. In my opinion, before revolutions can take place in the third world and fourth world, revolutions which will be enduring, and there have not been any revolutions like that that have been enduring, the capitalist world system, dominated by my own country, the United States, needs to be absented in itself. And then the possibility, not the inevitability, but the possibility of communism or socialism will present itself. As Stuart Hall, a Marxist, wisely wrote, in socialism or communism, there are no guarantees. We have no way of knowing whether, in fact, there will be revolutions. We can look at the world and say there is very little dialectical potential in the first world, where I am. We can say that there appears to be much greater dialectical potential in the third world and in the fourth world, because they are dominated by Western imperialism. Does that mean that there will be revolutions in the third and fourth worlds? No, not necessarily. It means that there is hope. And that's it. Hope. But hope is good. Nothing wrong with hope. Then eventually, I hope, the third and fourth worlds will guide the first world to its own revolutions. But I think that the third and fourth worlds need to take the lead. Now, I am not going to be paternalistic. For too long, the first world has treated the third world and the fourth world like children. And that is really, really demeaning. And it is not something that communists especially should ever do. But we have seen that quite a bit with first world communists. And so as a third world communist, third worldist communist, I reject that kind of paternalistic thinking and leave it to the third world to come up with a strategy for revolution on its own. Now, I can talk about it. I can podcast about it. My podcasting for me is a type of what Paulo Freire called conscientization, critical conscience, and consciousness raising. But it is not for me to tell people what to do. I can give my thoughts. I can provide some tips, whatever, based upon my own personal experience. But I have no right or authority to dictate to the third world and to the fourth world what they should do. That is not my prerogative. And so that's what I would say. If we want to understand the dialectic, it is best, I believe, to understand it in the context of what Roy Bhaskar wrote. And Roy Bhaskar described the dialectic as absenting absences, leading to transformation. It's much clearer than thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, which is very abstract. Bhaskar's interpretation of the dialectic is concrete, is real, because he was the founder of his particular school of critical realism. And so I hope that people will be influenced by him. He is departed. I wish he was not. I think that we really need Roy right now in the world. Roy was a wonderful, charismatic personality. If he were around today, I think that things might be somewhat different, including among critical realists, but we can't change what exists. Roy died. He had a horrible death, from what I understand. And I mean, horrible death. He had a degenerative disease. And I saw him on YouTube during the last year of his life, and he looked absolutely awful. So him dying when he did was not necessarily a bad thing. It relieved him of his pain. But now, as critical realists, we, as critical realists, have the pain of Roy Bhaskar's departure. And so I hope that we can take critical realism and Maoism, third worldism, and combine them together, because I think together they provide a blueprint, a methodology for achieving communism. For the time being, this has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. We are Bund. We are Bund. We are Bund. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.